as though the whole world was against her. Though she had never been a troublemaker, her parents treated her like one, and it had taken a toll on her. Rules like coming home at 5 p.m., not being allowed to have friends over or visit anyone else's house, made her feel isolated. She had to finish all of her homework immediately after school, no matter how long it took. And worst of all, her parents refused to buy her video games, forcing her to read books and then write reports on them to prove she had actually read them. But it wasn't the rules that hurt her most. It was the coldness of her parents. Her mother, a bitter woman, never hesitated to make Elena feel guilty for every mistake, no matter how small. Her father, on the other hand, never showed emotion, except when he yelled at her for poor grades or punished her for misbehaving. Elena's heart ached for any sign of compassion from them, but it never came. Her school's counselor, a man named Dr. Victor Gray, was another person she found herself avoiding. Dr. Gray was a quiet, soft-spoken man, always locked away in his office, doing paperwork. Elena had walked by his office countless times, seeing him alone and wondering why no other student ever came in for help. She decided to finally take the plunge. On March 6th, 1995, during her lunch break, Elena stood nervously in front of Dr. Gray's office door and knocked. He greeted her with a kind smile and waved for her to come inside. After a brief intro, Dr. Gray listened intently, nodding occasionally, and when Elena finished speaking, he surprised her by not offering the usual comforting words about how her parents loved her. Instead, he leaned forward and grinned.
I think I can help you, Elena. I'm the best psychologist there is. I promise. By the end of the month, your relationship with your parents will change. Forever.
Elena was skeptical, but she was desperate.
How?
She asked, her voice shaky.
I have my methods.
Dr. Gray replied with a cryptic smile.
But first, I need you to promise me something.
She raised an eyebrow.
What?
You have to come back tomorrow after school,
he said.
And don't tell anyone we had this conversation. It'll be our little secret.
She agreed, and so began the strange relationship between Elena and Dr. Gray. The next day, Elena returned to Dr. Gray's office. It was about 4 p.m. when she walked in. He greeted her warmly, but this time, something felt off. He closed the blinds over the window in his office door, ensuring no one could see inside.
Let's get to know each other better,
he said, sitting across from her with a notepad. For the next hour, they talked about her life, her favorite subjects in school, her hobbies, the things she hated most. Then, without warning, he offered her a drink.
Here, have some soda,
he said, pulling 2 cans from his mini fridge and opening them with a pop. Elena was surprised, but her parents had always forbidden her from drinking soda, and the temptation was too strong to resist. She took a sip, and before long, her vision blurred. She tried to fight the feeling, but everything went dark. When Elena awoke, she was disoriented, her head pounding. It took a few moments for her to realize she was lying on a bed, her hands cuffed to the frame. Panic surged through her as she struggled against the cold metal restraints, but they were too tight. She glanced around the room, and her stomach dropped. The walls were plastered with posters of comic book heroes and pictures of athletes. There was an old television in the corner, a Super Nintendo console beside it, and game cartridges scattered on a shelf. It didn't make sense. She was in a room designed for a child's enjoyment, yet she felt more trapped than she ever had before. Her eyes widened as the door creaked open. Dr. Gray walked in, smiling down at her.
"Good, you're awake,"
he said, his voice warm.
"Now listen carefully. I'm here to help you, Elena. I would never hurt you."
He removed the duct tape from her mouth and the cuffs from her hands.
"You're going to be staying here for a while, but don't worry. You can play with the toys and watch TV while I'm home. When I'm away, though, I'll have to cuff one hand to the bed. You can still watch the television, but I want you to watch the news. Just the news."
Elena could hardly process what he was saying, but the tone in his voice was reassuring. He made it seem normal, even comforting. Dr. Gray patted her on the shoulder.
"You'll be fine. I'll bring you dinner when I get back."
He left her alone in the room, locking the door behind him. Hours dragged on as Elena numbly watched television, her mind racing. Then, just as evening approached, Dr. Gray returned with a tray of mashed potatoes and chicken tenders.
"How long do I have to stay here?"
she asked quietly, finally finding the courage to speak.
"A month."
He answered, his tone casual.
"Maybe longer, depending on how things go."
The following morning, Dr. Gray woke her early. His face was serious, his demeanor different from usual.
"You need to keep the television on today. No exceptions,"
he said sternly. She nodded, uncertain, and after he left, she turned on the news. It didn't take long for a breaking news segment to flash across the screen. Elena's stomach lurched when she saw the headline.
"Missing child found. Human remains discovered."
Her yearbook photo appeared on the screen as the newscaster spoke about her disappearance. Her name and age flashed below the image. Her heart pounded as she watched her parents plead for her return in tearful interviews. She had never seen her father cry before. The guilt and confusion twisted in her gut. She'd never felt more trapped in her life. As days turned into weeks, Elena's confinement continued. Dr. Gray was always kind, but there were moments when she saw a darker side to him. He would lock her in the room, and his eyes would linger on her a little too long, as if savoring her fear. Then, one morning, Dr. Gray returned earlier than usual, his expression grim.
"Today, you need to watch the news. Don't turn it off no matter what."
The broadcast was another breaking news segment.
New evidence in missing child case. Police identify remains as local middle school student.
Elena's stomach turned as the news reported gruesome details of the body found under a highway overpass. The body had been decapitated, burned beyond recognition. And then they showed her school ID, melted but still legible. The newscaster spoke grimly.
Authorities are currently searching for suspects and attempting to identify the remains. The victim's identity is believed to be that of a missing 12-year-old from Townsville.
Elena's heart stopped. She knew that the body they were talking about was not hers. But who is it? Who's in her place? Would she take someone else's place too? Elena woke to the sound of whispers, a girl's voice, faint but distinct, from behind the door. She froze. It wasn't her voice. She was certain of it. Her pulse quickened as the footsteps approached, growing louder. Her breath caught when the door opened, revealing Dr. Gray.
"It's time,"
he said softly, his gaze unreadable.
"Time for what?"
Elena asked, a chill creeping up her spine. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes.
"The next chapter."
Her heart dropped.
gone well, but every story has its end.
She tried to focus, but her thoughts were swirling. The girl in the other room, she was going to take her place. Dr. Gray led her toward the door, the sound of muffled footsteps growing louder behind it. For a moment, their eyes met, her own, wide and terrified, and Elena saw in them the same fear she had once known. A fleeting understanding passed between them. He turned her away. The door shut behind them. When he spoke again, his voice was softer.
Rest now. The story will continue.
In the silence, Elena felt it. She knew what was coming.